Me to do? Do you want to? Okay, all right. There's some apples that need to be eaten in the back. I noticed that. Just a little housekeeping. So, this is the title of my talk, and I'm wondering if any of you have really regretted your title choice, because that's where I am. And surprisingly, it's not because I realized that it might be a bad idea to tell a large group of documentarians that I thought documentation was responsible for the downfall of contemporary spoken discourse. It's actually because my thinking has evolved on this topic. And I want to start by telling you, though, why this seemed like a good idea at one point. So I care deeply about the art and science of presentation. I have a background in competitive debate and oratory and persuasion, and I also spend some time editing fiction, so I live in the land of stories. And in working with executives and academics and government folks and activists, I was not satisfied with the idea that a tool was responsible for poor presentations. And ultimately, I wasn't satisfied with it because it wasn't helping me help people make better presentations. And so I started to look into what the root cause was. And when you look at the context of presentation, what I was finding, and you really see this when you get that window into how people think when they construct a presentation, what I found was that the urge to document was infiltrating that context of presentation. And so you can see why I was starting to kind of blame documentation. And it looks like these kinds of things. See those slides up there? They're not great experiences, but it looks like needing to write out an outline because what if you forget? It looks like needing to put all your data because what if someone needs to reference it? It looks like putting all the words there because what if I'm not there to explain the document, right? So that's what it looks like. But in my research, what I came to realize is that actually it's not that documentation was sucking up ground that I thought belonged to presentation. What was really happening was that both forms or genres were suffering. And so really it was that there was this confusion between the two, and what we've ended up with is this mishmash in the middle where we can't really tell the difference between the two. And I think the best word for that, I am open to suggestions, but right now, I think that the best word for that is conflation. Because what does conflation mean? It means when you take two distinct things and you treat them as if they're one. What's the implication of conflation? You lose the appearance of differences. And when you lose the appearance of differences, you no longer have data points on which to base your analysis. And if you don't have that good analysis, then you're probably not making good decisions. So I believe we are in a place where we are likely not making great decisions about both documentation and presentation, especially when they're in a culture or an environment where they're both salient genres and things that we should be doing, but we're not really able to tease apart when we should be doing one over the other, or whether there's an appropriate time for an overlap of the two. So let's start by figuring this shit out, right? Okay, so what's the difference between documentation and presentation? And I wanted to start with some things that I think are non-controversial, but I would love to talk to people afterwards if they disagree with these. So documentation is self-guided, right? Presentation is presenter-guided. Documentation, by and large, is meant to be read, and presentation, by and large, is meant to be heard and watched. So with these differences in place, I want to propose a principle, and I'm happy to fight about it, but I want to propose the idea that these differences are actually quite important. A skeptic might come and say that, well, why do these matter? Like, I see that they're differences, but why should they affect our behavior or what we do? And I think what cognitive scientists will tell us is that they matter because the way that our brains work and process the information is different. And at that point, if you understand that and you trust cognitive scientists, and they're a lousy bunch, so it's fair if you want to not trust them, but I happen to right now because I have yet to be proven wrong. But that means that if you want to communicate, regardless of which one you're choosing, then you need to be thinking about that format implications for the way our brains process that information. So what's the principle that I want to propose based on all this? Good presentation slides are bad documents. Thanks. This does not mean that good presentation slides aren't documents. I mean, they can be documents in some form. I don't want to argue semantics. I want to argue judgment calls about value and quality. And good presentation slides are bad documents. However, in my work, I've encountered what I think are kind of legitimate questions that people have asked when they have that urge to document. It's like a tickle sensation, I think, that they experience. And it's kind of like this thing that says, yeah, but what about this? But what about this? So here are those questions. Here are the tickle questions. How will I remember? How will I, as the presenter, remember these things? What will I share? I've worked so hard. What am I going to share as a product of this thing I've done? And a related question, but I think one that is qualitatively different, what if I'm not there to explain it? So I want to run through these questions and kind of give answers to them if you've ever felt the tickle of these questions when you've been a presenter. And then I want to tease apart documentation and presentation, really, so that we, as documentarians and as occasional presenters, can have a better understanding of what they are so that they both improve. Okay, so how will I remember? So I think really this question starts to get at like, well, who really matters? And many of the talks that we've heard today, the idea of audience has been explicit or implicit, right? It's a huge factor. Anytime you do anything that's communication, you need to think about your audience. So when you ask the question, how will I remember, you're prioritizing the wrong person there. Like, yes, you're there, the audience isn't gonna get anything if you're not there, but you're really prioritizing your needs over the audience's. And so I think, though, that there are some very easy answers to deal with this particular question. And really, what they are is that there's a pretty simple equation to remembering a presentation. And it's that a story structure needs to be there. And this is not just for the benefit of your audience, it's for the benefit of your working memory. Because a story structure helps retain things in your working memory as well. Throw in a little bit of rehearsal, absolutely essential. I do not tolerate the absence of rehearsal in people that I work with, and there you get retention. And what's beautiful is that many of these things work for both you and for your audience. However, if you still have a problem, and some people do, and there's no fighting it, if you still have a problem with retention, then luckily technology has answers for us. And there are basically ways of being able to almost view too much information about your slide so that you can see what's coming next, and it gives you those visual cues. Okay, so I think we've dealt with that. That urge to document you can handle without putting the unnecessary words on your slides. Can we all agree on that? I feel pretty good about that because I think that many of the presenters today have done an excellent job of avoiding this particular urge to document. Okay, what will I share? This one is a really good question. I empathize with this a lot, and I think it's fair. However, again, I do not believe that the urge to come up with something to share is worth sacrificing the here and now of your presentation. So I actually want to share a piece of advice from a local figure in the tech community, Matt Howey. You may know him. He's the founder of Metafilter. And he wrote this lovely down-to-earth piece on Medium about an introvert's guide to better presentations. I actually don't think there's anything specific to introverts in the article, and I recommend it. And he has this little thing at the end that he mentions where he says, yeah, but what happens if someone says, can I have a copy of your slides? And his response is basically, well, yeah, but they're kind of worthless without me, right? Getting back to that principle of good presentation slides are bad documents. And what he says is that if video is not provided, and we're lucky to live in a world in which video is the primary documentation for our talks, especially industry conference talks, but if you don't have that available to you, or if you're doing something that isn't in a setting that's quite like this, then he just recommends make your own. Get a webcam, record your talk. How is that going to hurt you? How is it going to hurt the audience necessarily? Then you get to address the audience that you're in front of and address them with the authenticity and the good presentation slides that they deserve. And then you're also saving something for your future audience as well without compromising either one. Okay, so what if I'm not there to explain? This one really gets at the question of, well, are you talking about documentation or presentation? Because if you're asking, what if I'm not there to explain something, then then you're violating that basic idea of what's the difference between documentation and presentation. And I think this happens a lot. Based on my research of looking into people who do organizational studies, there are titles of talks that are things like the genre of PowerPoint in the consulting industry, and I read these things, which is a little horrifying, but they're actually very instructional. And what I have found is that this question comes up all the time, because the notion of presentation, sometimes with PowerPoint in front, has really evolved to be something that is actually a project deliverable in some ways, right? And so what we have is a difference between the two. And I pulled out these comments from that article that Matt Howey wrote, and he had someone say, hey, great idea to do a video, but where I work, the executives won't tolerate that because I'm not going to be there to explain the damn bullet points that I have to put into the presentation that's being circulated so an executive can review it, right? And Matt Howey accurately points out that those are two different things. So I want to show you a little bit more evidence, if you're not convinced yet, that we have a crisis, maybe a bit extreme, but we have a crisis in differentiating between documentation and presentation. And it's not just on an individual level, I think it's collective. This is Exhibit A. Let's look at Exhibit B. This is a fun one. Anyone recognize this from General Petraeus's briefings? Anyone there? This is a military document that's about the strategy in a war. This was one of the most important pieces of visual communication to explain a strategy that was a little bit unconventional at the time. And this is a PowerPoint slide. This was distributed among the highest generals and officials in the US military to basically get approval. It was not just communication. This was used as a way of getting approval. So this to me conveys part of that dissonance between, wait, what are we talking about? Is this a presentation or is this a document? And I think the US military is confused about it, and so is NASA and its contractors. This is a slide from Boeing. This is actually kind of a sad note in the Columbia 2003 disaster. So I don't know if you all remember that, but when that shuttle took off, there was something aberrant that happened, and it was actually what ended up being the thing that on re-entry killed all of that crew. And they knew that it happened. And so there was all this analysis that went in to that specific thing by Boeing, by NASA, by other contractors. And this is one of those products that they produced. This is something that it feels, right? This is technical documentation, highly technical, that should go in a report with recommendations and conclusions. And they produced a slide. They have a slide deck. And I believe that Jeffrey mentioned earlier Edward Tufte. Edward Tufte goes so far as to basically accuse PowerPoint of causing some of the lack of good analysis on the part of NASA and Boeing because of slides like this. And I believe that it's because there's a confusion between presentation and documentation. Tufte believes that PowerPoint's just evil. So our views are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they are different. So, okay, that's Exhibit B. Let's look to people who are like the thought leaders on PowerPoint. So this guy, former Microsoft employee, he has a quite successful book on PowerPoint, and I want to show you his method. Everyone's got a method, right? It's called the MindWorks presentation method. But I think what's worth pointing out is that it's called a presentation method, but who's at the center of that presentation? Not you as an audience, but a reader, right? So if there's not a better demonstration of someone who is a thought leader on PowerPoint presentations being confused about the difference, I think this is it. Are we talking about a reader, or are we talking about someone in the audience who's listening? Okay, another guy who's wrote a series of quite good books about presentation. PowerPoint is not a tool for document creation. Thank you, someone has declared that. Okay. But then we also look to Nancy Duarte, who is probably the foremost thought leader on presentation and the art of presentation. And she's kind of starting to say, well, actually, programs like PowerPoint were created to make slide presentations, but she's also arguing that many of the files that we create are meant to be read. They're meant to be printed. So I think we're not good at distinguishing these. We have a problem with understanding that difference. We're at a point where we have that conflation. So what do we do? Because here's what's at stake. What's at stake is that our documents suffer as well when we don't understand the difference. So both our presentations can be improved, as can our documents. But this is a cultural thing. I think that evidence really indicates that this is a collective confusion. It's not just something that's isolated to a few people throughout our organizations. And I think that what really happens as a trigger, if you have a sense that this may be happening, is that we really have trouble when a document or a presentation or a communication tool is meant to inform and it's meant to contain compelling visuals. That's the point at which we really start to have this kind of crisis of being able to differentiate. So I want to give you some tools for what you can do. These are taken from people who've started to address this problem. Okay, well, not surprisingly, my advice to you is to document something, and it's to document the difference. And I started to do that by saying, look, presentations are meant to be heard and watched, right? Not read. So that's an important difference. But in your specific cultures and organizations, the difference may have may have an interesting flavor that varies across our organizations and across our groups. So I urge you to just it's a table that will maybe take up to, I don't know, you could probably do it in 80 words. You could document the differences between those so that you, at least, as someone who's responsible for documents, have an idea of what the differences are. So that's the starting place. Nancy Duarte has done some of that for us, and the way that she really differentiates them is to say, do you need to give a presentation, or actually do you need to have a conversation? And this is a really relevant question for those of us who are in the position of also having that question about what we do with meetings. What are meetings really for? What is the purpose of meetings? And I would wager a bet that many of you have experienced meetings in which someone shows up and gives a presentation for 40 minutes, and what really needed to happen was that everyone got onto the same page, and then those 40 minutes were used for substantive discussion. Right? What you needed to have was a conversation, not to see a presentation while someone just clicks through slides that are basically the same words that he or she is saying in the meeting, right? That's one of our most infuriating circumstances. It's the thing that led to the death by PowerPoint statement, and yet it's still happening pretty ubiquitously. Not in context like this, because people have figured out, well, this is clearly a talk, but it is happening in the context of our meetings. And that's why I think it needs to be documented within your organization. Okay, so this is a bold proposal. It's just eliminate the presentation. We don't do presentations anymore. That doesn't happen in our organization. It seems bold, but it's something that basically Amazon has done. So the first 10 minutes of most meetings at Amazon, as well as LinkedIn, are basically spent of 10 minutes of silence, where everyone reads over the same document. It's usually a document that includes visuals and text. It's a good balance in terms of density of information. Everyone spends that 10 minutes, and then you have the rest of the time to have a substantive discussion. Because those organizations have decided that's what they need to make progress and to be able to have productive meetings. I'm interested in this, and I would love to hear from anyone who has done anything like this, or maybe de facto has a situation where they have eliminated the presentation. So the other suggestion is for you all basically to create a visual document. And I think we've had quite a few speakers who've either addressed this directly or on the fringe. But if you or your group or your organization doesn't yet have a format or a way of thinking about visual documents, then just go and create one. And luckily, not surprisingly, Nancy Duarte, again, has basically created a format that she calls slide docs. And it's kind of a combination between a document and a presentation. It's not kind of, that's actually exactly what it is. And she actually creates them in PowerPoint, which you argue for or against that. But this is a sample page of that. And it's a great example of something that is not a good slide. That's too much text. I should not be showing you this as a slide, right? But as a document, it's lovely, it's well organized, and the balance of visual content to text is appealing and appropriate for the format. I think a cognitive scientist would tell us that this is an appropriate distribution of information, and the use of visuals is a good cue to match the text. So if you're curious about being able to do this, you do not have to start with a blank page. I know that that's another one of the principles we've come across today. You can go check out Nancy Duarte's slide docs as at least an example. She has even templates that you can download. So if you're in a position of thinking this would be valuable as something to just kind of start to play with to address that urge to document, I think this is a good tool. So the last thing that I would say is a good recommendation for helping to tease apart the differences is to nurture a culture of presentation. And I actually have a story about having done this, and the story starts at Write the Docs last year. So I don't know, many of you may remember Mo, who gave a presentation earlier. Yeah, that was a little whoop whoop. Yep, there he is in the back. So Mo and I work at the same organization, one of Portland's largest employers, and we came to this conference both kind of on a whim last year, and we met and we started meeting afterwards to try to figure out how to improve our workplace, basically. And we started off with the idea of something like a doc day. I think we were calling it Doc Rocks, right? Yeah, which is kind of a better name. But what happened is it actually evolved into a series of lightning talk events, because what we wanted to do is to nurture community, but we also, my particular selfish interest, was to nurture a culture of presentation. And so what it is it's a space where people come and give 5-minute talks, great, just like we have here, but it can't be related to work. And what that does is that takes it out of the work context and it says, you can have one idea and you present that and it's limited to 5 minutes, and we work with you to say, are your slides doing what they need to do to accurately support you as the presenter, you as the shining star of that context? So it's an experiment. I don't have any hard data to show you, but our hypothesis is that by supporting a healthy culture of presentation and really removing it from project deliverables and from the urge to document, is that we can start to create a different urge. That tickle may transform for some of our colleagues into something that's more of a, oh, hey, I have to give a presentation to a whole bunch of MDs about why we are switching to ICD-10, and I need to convince them and transform their behavior. And so what I'm actually going to think about is not documenting every damn thing about ICD-9 or 10 or whatever, but I'm actually going to think about how to tell a little bit of a story and to do something like what I've seen people do in the really compelling, funny, and moving talks that I've seen from my colleagues. So that's a long hypothesis. Maybe a little wordy, but that's our working hypothesis, and I hope that at some point we can come back and report about whether that has been successful. But I think that what happens if you nurture the culture of presentation, in addition to what I believe almost all of us are already doing, because that's why we're here, is we're nurturing a culture of documentation. And so what I believe is that if you only do one, because of this, the state of our contemporary feelings and notions about both documentation and presentation, is that if you only do one, you are likely to not actually be moving forward and to be enhancing both, but you're likely to just be letting one kind of seed ground from the other. And the way that we can all improve both documentation and presentation is to clearly understand the differences between them. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful time at the party.